questions. Okay, so our next speaker is Roger Norman, and for those of you that have read, a lot of when you study health and human rights, you often read works by Roger and Sarah Zaidi. So Zaidi and Norman, who have written extensively on human rights, especially as it pertains to health. Now, Roger was the Asia Pacific Director for the International Commission of Jurists from 2008 to 2011. He's taught law and justice at Columbia University and Lahore University. And he's published extensively Health and Human Rights at the UN, The Politics of Universal Justice. He is not only a lawyer, but he's also has a degree in theological studies. So I'm very excited to have that perspective come out as well. So Roger, please.
So thank you, Salman, for that introduction and for inviting me to this very interesting workshop. And I've had to change my remarks a bit because of the morning session, which has raised a lot of good questions, I think, difficult questions. And I wasn't planning on getting into theology very much, but thinking about it, human rights has been rightly criticized, I believe, as a theological initiative. In other words, a religion that asks people to believe in immutable truths that let's just say, have not necessarily a basis in empirical realities, although I don't want to offend anyone who believes in certain types of religions. Now, as a lawyer and a law professor who has taught legal writing, I am going to tell you what I will talk about, then talk about it, then tell you what I just talked about. You see, that's our method. So the first thing is kind of why Sarah and I turned to examining the history of human rights, especially the history of how the actual legal framework was developed, primarily at the UN. Second will be, in a sense, a follow-up to what we heard this morning, which is legal accountability does not work very well. It's incredibly challenging. Why is that? And so the answer that we came up with is it's that way by design. And the successes that we have had have come against the grain through popular mobilizations and intellectual interventions and all of this. Third, I will make a brief stab at optimism in terms of where we go from here. Now, I have to say, normally at these types of conferences, I'm not the optimist. I've been working in the field for 20 plus years. It's very difficult to be optimistic. But having heard what I've heard, I'm gonna make an effort. We don't want it all in one direction. And let me say, actually, I think the context of that, the need for optimism, is what we heard this morning, kind of the crisis of democracy that we seem to be facing, the crisis of rights. And because a lot of my historical research was the 1930s period, leading to World War II, leading to the creation of human rights, I think we're in a very dangerous period because I see a lot of similarities. I mean, people have, I think, a bit recklessly made that comparison, and we're like Nazi Germany and this and that. I think a lot of that is overblown, but there are very, very important similarities. For example, a powerful country that has a lot of economic hardship and uncertainty and fear, which frankly, our situation is nothing like the situation in the 1930s in America and the rest of, and Germany for that matter. But it doesn't matter. I mean, I think the trends are similar, and the outcomes can lean in that direction. So I think that just makes it all the more important for those of us who are concerned about this. I think actually many people are concerned, but for those of us who work for a living on these types of issues, to to understand the roots of how we've gotten here, which is necessary to think about where do we go from here. What is to be done, as someone once said. But first, a thought experiment I'd like you all to engage in. So imagine Boston, or for that matter, the entire United States, having a legal system that's very high-minded, wonderful, noble. Take the American Bill of Rights and add economic and social rights to it, which it now lacks. And, so we love the law, the legal framework, but we have no judges to pass decisions. We have no police to enforce those decisions, meaning it's actually a state of lawlessness. And people may think it's worse than ordinary lawlessness because the gap between what we say we are and we want to be and the reality is immense. So that is the state of international law. That's the state of international human rights law, really quite exactly. There are no tribunals that can pass judgments, even make decisions. There is no global international police force unless you take the United States. The United States may consider itself a global police force, but it's not grounded in global mechanisms or global law. So a very famous international jurist in the 30s and 40s called for this reason, because there are certain core constituents of law as commonly understood. Domestic law. Rights imply duties, imply systems capable of determining based on evidence what is criminality, what is not criminality, for example, and then means to enforce what has been decided by society through its legal system. But what we have, as Hirsch Lauterpacht said, is so international law lies at the vanishing point of law for this reason. Doesn't have those mechanisms. Human rights is the vanishing point of the vanishing point. And I think he's right. And a quick comparison, look at what human rights has, and I'll get into that, the enforcement mechanisms, the lack thereof, for 60 years. Now compare it to international trade law through the WTO, through GATT, from 1994, much more recent. Judicial panels, unaccountable judicial panels. States take them very seriously. They show up with their full legal power and decisions, which are meaningful because they impose financial penalties that can run to the hundreds of millions of dollars, that have run to the millions. So this is a form of international law, but it's not human rights. And we could see why, how did it go? And by the way, trade law is not put as a primary purpose of the United Nations, right? Human rights, development, peace, and a fourth one are in the UN Charter, in the first article. These are the primary purposes, and yet those purposes are toothless, have no enforcement. Why? How? So, my co-author, Sarah Zaidi, and I, of this tome, I'm gonna do this book, which is a historical book, way too many footnotes, a tad boring at times, in about 2 minutes, I hope. So why did we do this? Both Sarah and I come in as a lawyer. She's a public health trained at Harvard. We came into this out of frustration, a lot of frustration. We'd spent many years doing on-the-ground work, but seeking to influence policy. And let's just say we didn't have a lot of success. Actually, the funny thing is we had a lot of success in the metrics that NGOs use to judge themselves, unfortunately. Media exposure, money, the self-perpetuation of your own existence. But if we look at what we cared about, the outcomes on the ground, not much success. So why? How did this work? hold on, let me get to number 2. And here actually, another quote, similar quote by someone 60 years later, Mark Mazauer, who's a very good historian, especially of that interwar period, 30s and 40s. He asked the question, why does human rights have no history? No documented history. This is also what got us interested. I mean, why do people either just assume human rights just came to us, on a stone tablet, or human rights is meaningless, nonsense, and nothing? That's kind of the debate. So he called it, he said, I won't get the quote exactly right, but the history of law is a ghetto in the discipline of history. So human rights is a ghetto within the ghetto. Again, we just have these similar themes that, yeah. And I think this has been a real problem in the human rights movement. And it's something that I have tried to raise within the movement, because no one wants to air their dirty laundry in public. I shouldn't say that. Some people love that. But I was not interested in that because I want the success of human rights. I want to improve it. So you try to work within it rather than saying, look at all the bad things we do. There are enough people doing that. I didn't think it was useful. But it is important to think, why not? So as individuals, self-analysis is good. Self-criticism, self-knowledge, self-awareness. The whole field of psychology is based on that can lead you to better behavior and better balance. But within this movement, it was non-existent, that type of self-awareness, self-criticism. Okay, now very quickly, as I said, human rights was designed to be ineffective. Who designed it? Human rights, there's a long history that I won't get into. I mean, a lot of people will trace human rights back to religious tradition, back to, the equality of all humans under God. I don't really agree with that because, most religious traditions stress absolute obedience to the higher authority without questioning. And so I actually think that tradition, that religious tradition, is what led to feudalism, the bowing down to unaccountable authorities. And human rights was a reaction against that, right? It was, in fact, the birth of human rights is actually linked to the birth of mercantilism and capitalism, which are revolutions. I mean, these were, the left is very anti-capitalist, let's say now, but back then that was the left. That movement tried to shake off feudalism with this new wonderful, and it was for all people. There are plenty of flaws, but that was the idea. And so we have John Locke, we have all of the natural rights philosophers, the French, Voltaire, who were not speaking, Thomas Paine, they weren't speaking in abstract at meetings. Their ideas were part of ongoing revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, that created a set of new legal ideas, the rights of man, and all of this. So that was undermined in the 19th century when kind of Hobbes took over. I would say the Leviathan. The notion of the 19th century was the consolidation of nation states, of state power. The Napoleonic era in Europe, individual rights disappeared. It was not talked about really much if you compare it to that earlier time until World War I. When it was raised again, not as individual rights, but as group rights, collective rights, minorities, workers, women, the suffragette movement. And again, but given a huge boost by war, which is an irony of human rights. Wilson, the 14 points, President Woodrow Wilson, this put onto the international stage the notion of rights, national rights primarily. And of course, those notions were completely undermined by what happened. So the rights were promoted during the war. Come, rally to our side. We're going to give you all these things. Not after the war. The Treaty of Versailles was a continuation of colonization and the dividing up of the world and all of this. And then, of course, the League of Nations was undermined. How was it undermined? It was undermined by fascist movements, pointing out the hypocrisies, the overt hypocrisies of the liberal international order. Again, parallels to today. And another thing to remember is there was plenty of fascism in America in the late 30s. Overt. Much more than today, I would say, in terms of, after the war, there were no fascists left anywhere, including Germany. You lose, you disappear. You disappear from history, in fact, to a degree. But not at the time. At the time, there was a lot of opposition to FDR, very powerful movements that were law and order movements. We want the trains to run on time. We have economic insecurity. We want the strong man, right? It wasn't just Italy. It was throughout Europe, And actually what happened is the moderates made a huge mistake of allying with the right to kill the left during this period. The right then killed the moderates. And again, today, we have to think about these things. So what you had in World War II, again, World War II, the Atlantic Charter, this was Roosevelt and Churchill rallying the world in favor of human rights. So human rights was central. And, we represent the rights of all humans, and they are the fascists who want race to dominate. It was a clear ideological distinction, a mobilization. The great powers discussed human rights secretly. Yalta, the secret meetings before the UN was established in San Francisco, and they all decided no human rights. We'll say that to people, but that's not what we're going to do. And although actually the US was a little more keen on it, in fact, and the reason is because human rights they understood that human rights is a very powerful ideological weapon. Even if it's not legal, it's a powerful weapon against the Soviet Union as it became, and against the UK. And Churchill knew that because colonialism was no longer acceptable. And so who was going to take over as the British withdrew? The Americans wanted to do that, and they wanted to use rights, freedom, be free from the British, as long as our corporations as long as we establish military bases on your territory and our corporations take over. But again, human rights became, shall we say, marginalized, and it was brought back at the San Francisco conference to an extent by civil society lobbying. There's no question. So the history I'm not talking about, I'm talking about the history of states now, and you lose a full view of history because history is people and movements, and states interact with these other forces. And those forces were very strong. Those forces made their first appearance, I would really argue, in World War I. The Hague peace conferences, which of course failed. The Hague peace conferences were 1899 and 1907, and a few years later you had World War I. But they brought to the fore for the first time media, public opinion, pressure. So whereas before diplomacy was a few men in a smoky room, that's all it was. You didn't need public accountability, regardless of whether you were considered a democracy or not much. And that changed, particularly in World War II. So it came back. Human rights was brought back in. But the whole history there is the smaller nations, particularly the Latin Americans, wanting real human rights, wanting an enforceable system of law, wanting protection. Now, why? You can imagine. Within the state system, small states are face the problem of domination and intervention by large states. So the small states were allied with popular opinion. We also have to remember, World War II was a global catastrophe. It was that period was such a rich period, intellectual period, in terms of ideas of justice and peace and human rights. So whereas before there was very little talk, suddenly lots and lots of discourse, not just lawyers thinking, what do we do? Like, we have a new world. We have a new opportunity, a real one, not like Senior Bush's New World Order. Let's defeat Iraq and proclaim a new world order. But what happened is what happens in any diplomatic negotiations. US, Soviet, UK made the decisions. You had democratic pretense, but decisions were made. Now, the main channel was the Commission on Human Rights, which was renamed 10 years ago, the Human Rights Council. What is the only, it's the only human rights body, but I don't think the specialized agencies, WHO, UNICEF, were mentioned and empowered in the UN Charter. I think the only agency mentioned in the UN Charter was the CHR, the Commission on Human Rights. Chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, this was considered a great coup. FDR was seen as favorable to economic rights, his four freedoms, favorable to internationalism. And so there was a lot of hope placed in Eleanor Roosevelt and this commission. So what happened is there was meant to be one Bill of Rights, one international Bill of Human Rights, which would compass all the rights, including economic and social. At the time, there was not the division. We're all used to this division. It didn't exist back then, or it hadn't been laid out. And in a court to enforce, a high commissioner. All of these ideas were put forward, and then they lay dormant for 50 years. We got the high commissioner in the mid-90s, ICJ just recently, extending a human rights mandate. All of these ideas were put forward in more powerful terms 60 years ago by the leading jurists of their day who were sitting on this Commission for Human Rights. And you couldn't have gotten a better scenario, and yet the outcome was, I would say, pretty catastrophic for human rights. Why? Because it was state-centric. Because these members of the CHR were not individual jurists. They answered to their... And in fact, there's a lot of, if you get into the papers, Eleanor Roosevelt had a very difficult time doing what she was doing. She tried to fight the State Department. She didn't want to, but she did. Now, I want to give one example of this that really encapsulates it. So first of all, why would the Soviet Union want any international authority to be able to intervene in its domestic legal system? They had gulags and all the rest. Why would the US want that? Racism, Jim Crow. There was overt legal racism in the US. Why would the UK want it? Colonialism, right? So none of these great powers wanted it, and it came to the fore when, now the CHR was very publicly known. That was a time when human rights was on the public mind all over the world. Great hopes were invested in this CHR, this commission. So it was flooded by thousands of petitions from all over the world. They didn't know what to do with this because they didn't know who they were. They hadn't developed anything. So they kind of were, it seemed like they would be forced to take them. One of the most compelling petitions, and there's a great book by Carol Anderson about this, the NAACP decided we have no hope to fight racism within this legal system. Even FDR was beholden to the southern states. They were Democrat at the time. We're going to petition the UN. We know, Eleanor. There were personal relationships. Roger Baldwin, W. Du Bois, very famous, great leaders, went to Eleanor Roosevelt, produced a fantastic petition documenting all the examples of legal racism, practical racism, and the commission made the decision called the no power doctrine. I love the legal terms. The no power doctrine means we have no power to look at your petitions. So let's put them in the garbage, literally. That was it. I think there were something like 9,000 petitions after 1 year of this commission being in existence. So that was gone. But the debate was still there. Do we have measures of implementation and enforcement, which means a high commissioner, a court, or a requirement that states incorporate international into their domestic systems, which all of us have argued that's the only way at the end of the day to make change. It has to be national, has to be domestic, including public pressure. It doesn't work in New York and Geneva unless it's supported by local pressure. So that was known back then too, of course. So the CHR postponed the treaties. Treaties are legally binding. They created the Universal Declaration, which it is now considered to have the status of customary international law, which means, according to, I don't know the word to use, but according to wishful thinking international lawyers, that means it's binding, but customary international law is really not binding in the real world. And it's actually based on state practice. So if we're serious about state practice, we don't want that to be legally binding, right? State practice tends not to favor human rights, tends not to follow the Universal Declaration. That happened. It was then, you had the Universal Declaration. It was split into three things: the Declaration, the treaties, which were binding, and the measures of implementation. The treaties got caught up in Cold War politics, got split into civil, political, economic. Civil, political was prioritized. Economic rights were not made absolute. They were dependent on the resources of the country, because poor countries were like, we can't do this. And U.S. didn't want it to be considered a right. So there was a coincidence of opinion. But the most interesting thing is the third branch was just dropped. Measures of implementation was dropped, never happened. And that's why we have the system we have today. It's not an accident. We can explain why it's so difficult because of the lack of I mean, imagine if we actually had a court that we could petition to on all of these terrible violations that happen. The facts are clear. States violate rights. Not just states. International organizations can, et cetera, but we don't have that mechanism, meaning we have to do all the creative things that we do, find different ways to do pressure. It can happen. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it would be a whole lot easier if we had a real legal system with enforcement mechanisms. So now, let me conclude with my third thing, right, which is, what do we do? I think I wrote about this somewhere. Okay. Oh, yeah. So let me give, in the paper, I give a couple of examples, Afghanistan and Iraq, that are not very optimistic. So let me bring up the example of AIDS and the right to health linked to AIDS, which is one of the most successful, I think, initiatives on rights that's ever happened. And I was involved in some of that effort, some of those cases in the late 90s and I guess early. When was the big UNGAS meeting? Was that 2003, 2001? Yeah, so, I mean, that obviously spurred a whole lot of action, activism, et cetera. Now, why was that relatively successful? I would argue that it's based on the methods. The methods that were used turn out to be, I don't know if there was a lot of thought, but in my experience, my group has developed, not most groups have developed kind of a 5-pronged strategy, right? And all of them are necessary. All of them feed into each other, I feel. And, they give you the best opportunity to make change. First one is research, documentation. Where's the evidence? If I'm a state, I deny. That's always the first recourse. So you need the research, you need academics. And actually the work we did in Iraq in 91 and future, in fact, all the work we did, when we went on a mission, we didn't take lawyers alone. We had lawyers, public health experts, environmental scientists, development economists, because the whole point was human rights violations are interdisciplinary. And the research has to be interdisciplinary. And the research has to be really good, has to be credible, has to be maybe not at the level of peer-reviewed academic journals, but actually close. In fact, most of the missions we did, we would have our members write peer-reviewed academic articles. 1, 2, exposure. You need exposure. You don't have exposure, no one knows. Now, media is the main example, celebrities, whatever you can do to get that exposure, because exposure leads to public awareness. Public awareness creates political pressure. Exposure also empowers the community. Now, that's the third and most important prong. Community mobilization, community participation, these buzzwords that we're afraid to say now because they've been taken over in the wrong way, but they're critical. As I said, if you want to make a change, whether it's a legal change, a policy change, a social change, a huge flaw of the human rights movement has been Northern dominated, Northern funded, Northern everything. And while lip service was always paid to having local partners, I've seen it for 20 years. Even now, it's the question is, where's the money going? That's really the question. If all the money is in these groups and you're doling, I'll give you a little to do the local research, then I'll use it to improve my brand, which is usually what happens. That's not collaboration. So community mobilization leading to local pressure, which is then supplemented by international pressure. International pressure is important. Pronouncements by toothless UN agencies are still important because they can be used locally for political pressure. It's just that, what I find so difficult is I go to a country and I meet the activists and they go, oh, things are horrible here. Let's go to the ICJ. Let's do international. Like, it doesn't work that way, unfortunately, right? So the fourth is strategic litigation. We have to call it strategic litigation. We don't want to just be lawsuits. But it's real. Strategic litigation means you're not bringing a case because you're going to win. I've never won a case, to be honest, in international law. And the one case we did win, which I was mentioning, this huge case in Ecuador, Chevron, oil contamination, indisputable. Chevron's own evidence, records showed that. They took it away. $9 billion judgment taken away by legal shenanigans in this country. So, but strategic litigation is incredibly important because you create a file and a dossier, you create evidence, you present evidence, and evidence to court has to be at a high level, right? So you're asking for a high level of evidence gathering, which is great. You involve communities in evidence gathering, and you raise the issue publicly. It's a very strong public posture to bring a lawsuit. And it's not just that, it makes people feel, especially affected people, that we have a voice, even if you don't win, which we always tell them, probably not going to win. I want to give a quick example of that so we can understand the notion of strategic litigation. And I'll first say the fifth. The fifth is lobbying for policy change. You go to you go to Congress, you go to the UN, even if it's toothless. You go wherever you can to try to make that policy change. But you'll never get the policy change if you don't have the community pressure, the research, possibly the lawsuits and other methods. And this is what the AIDS movement did at the time, knowingly or unknowingly. Research, lawsuits, we were involved in a number of lawsuits around generics, around access to, using the right to health, using those methods of the right to health, although usually having to do it in domestic law. India, Brazil, strong local organizations. The lawyers were Indian lawyers, Brazilian lawyers, with support from us. So, but I'll say the other thing about AIDS. I think it's important to note that the reason why I think it's been successful is who are the constituencies of AIDS? Who suffers? It's a disease that hits everyone, rich and poor. Elites suffered from AIDS. They have power. Western elites can mobilize in ways that poor people can't. So TB, disease, sanitary diseases, you don't have a constituency because they're poor people. It's very hard for poor people to be able to raise the voice the way people suffering from AIDS were able effectively to do it. A lot of there were great pressure tactics that movement developed, very confrontational and innovative. So quick example, very famous in the United States. Law can never advance on its own. People should not look at human rights law or lawyers to really make that kind of change. Brown v. Board of Education. The same people, NAACP, they went to the UN, so they went domestic again, and Thurgood Marshall, these great lawyers, did it through law primarily. Brown v. Board of Education was 1954. They won. Huge case, overturning 200 years of precedent. What happened? Nothing. Desegregation, 6 poor black kids had to desegregate 6 states. It was terrible, actually. They faced terrible conditions until the legal idea was taken up as mass movements, social movements, the civil rights movement. It required social mobilization to make that legal victory mean anything. And that's always true. And they had a victory. It's hard to get those victories. Okay, final thing on optimism. Oh no, here we go. Well, the AIDS example, I could have used Iraq. Okay, here's the most general cause for optimism. I think we all have an extremely distorted view of the world and of human rights issues. Primarily because our experience, unless we go, those of us who have been to countries, fine, you have your own experience, right? A very famous poet said, "I know only what I experience." But our experiences, the general public's experiences, are mediated. There's an intervening force called the media. And the media, especially now, it's infotainment. It's sensationalism. And especially with social media, it's frightening. If you're a good person, you've done 1,000 good deeds in your life, if you are caught on social media with one bad deed that may not even be true, that's who you are. You're defined. Same is true with media coverage, right? So I actually think the world revolves around people doing thousands and thousands of nice things in their life. People are generally good. But what do we see? You've got a town, what do we see? The murder, the terrorist act, right? And we all know that it is the media exposure itself that feeds the power of terrorism or the power of Trumpism, right? But the way the media is structured, which is essentially a profit-making enterprise where they think, viewer goes up when we show the blood, it's very boring to show nice acts that people do. So on the one hand, I actually think the world is not quite as dire as we take it to be with this constant stream of what we called in Iraq weapons of mass deception, which is exactly what it was. It was just putting out lies as truth. And none of that has ever really been rectified. But so what I think we need to do is rebalance the narrative, reclaim the words, put out alternative visions that actually correspond to the way most people feel, what most people want. In some ways, there is a huge constituency for the kind of work we do. It's ordinary people. You look at the healthcare debate in this country, it's so clear that most people want something very different than what we have. So it's these political bottlenecks that we have that have to be confronted, addressed, overcome, and using human rights is not a failed strategy. It has been in many ways. It's not necessarily, but I think we need to know the history. We need to know the obstacles. We need to address head-on those obstacles instead of burying our heads in the sand. Now, I've told some of my friends and colleagues I need to write a book called Confessions of a Failed Human Rights Activist, because in many ways, I think those of us in the field feel that way, but what is success and failure? How do you define? If you define success as winning the lawsuit, forget it. If you define success, and I have a close friend at one of the big human rights organizations who's been pushing them to actually audit their own work and ask how many times you've gone to this country and that country and say, our recommendations, we ask for 10 things. How many times have any one of those things been accomplished? It's not good, right? But of course, they don't want to do that audit, right? And the donors don't want them to do that audit. So I would just close by saying, I think in some ways things are not as dire as they appear, but they're pretty dire. And, as they say, one child who dies from an easily preventable disease is one too many. So we still have a lot of work to do. Thank you.